morning. Welcome. My name is David Morrow, and on behalf of the Institute for Philosophy and Public Policy at George Mason University, I'd like to welcome you to this discussion on ethics and climate policy. Thanks to the Wilson Center for hosting and co-sponsoring this event, and many thanks to everyone else who helped organize it, especially Roger Mark and Benjamin Dills of the Wilson Center, Jesse Kirkpatrick and Andrew Light, the Institute for Philosophy and Public Policy. The Institute, founded over 30 years ago, is the oldest research institution in the United States, providing expertise on normative dimensions of public policy. Directed by Dr. Andrew Light, the Institute's staff includes leading ethicists, economists, and political scientists working on pressing issues of public policy, such as climate change and environmental sustainability, emerging technologies, international development, and peace and conflict. Institute staff have held high-level positions in the U.S. Department of State, serve as consultants to the U.S. defense community, are frequent advisors to federal agencies and other governments, and have strong connections to Washington-based NGOs and think tanks. Today, we've convened a panel of accomplished scholars and policy experts to discuss the relevance of ethics to climate policy. Many of you work on or take an interest in climate policy, I'm guessing, because you think that climate change is a morally important problem. Our first speaker today is Stephen Gardner, who's done more than most people to highlight the moral dimensions of climate change. And while many of you presumably agree about many of these moral dimensions, many of you may also agree with our second speaker, intrepid traveler David Weisbach, that when it comes to international climate policy, policy should be guided by national self-interest. Professors Gardner and Weisbach have just published a book on this very topic, Debating Climate Ethics, and since their book inspired today's event, we're particularly honored to have them here with us today. We're also fortunate to be joined by Gwen Taraska from the Center for American Progress, David Waskow from World Resources Institute, and Alyssa Bernstein from Ohio University. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
So welcome again. We'll do a quick switch out here. So welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm Roger Mark D'Souza, and I know many of you are familiar with the Wilson Center. We serve as the living memorial to President Wilson, and we're quite pleased to be able to host today's conversation as part of our ongoing series on managing our planet, which is organized with George Mason University, the Center's Brazil Institute, and our Environmental Change and Security Program. So many of you are familiar with Jane Harmon, who is the president and CEO of the Wilson Center. And Jane describes the Wilson Center as an intellectual candy shop where you don't get fat on spin. So I think that's an interesting framing for a good debate this morning in a cozy room. So I'm glad to see that we have such strong interest. But we're looking at climate policy and climate ethics. And we've had a very good introduction by David. Thank you very much. And I think we want to move straight to our presenters. And we'll start with Stephen, who will give us some opening comments and kick us off. So Stephen, I'll hand it over to you.
Is this on? Well, first, thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here and talking about these important issues. What I'm going to try to do in the very brief 15 minutes that I have, philosophers can't say anything in 15 minutes, so what I'm going to try to do is just give you a teaser for some of the themes that come up in the book in the hope that we can pursue them a little more in the Q&A and then later perhaps in the panel discussion. So, President Obama said in the second inaugural, "We the people still believe that our obligations as Americans are not just to ourselves, but to all posterity. We will respond to the threat of climate change, knowing that failure to do so would betray our children and future generations. So we get a very overtly ethical framing, from my point of view, of the climate problem and why we should worry about it, and particular highlighting of the idea that failure would be a certain kind of moral failure, in the president's language, a betrayal. Okay, I'll try.
That's it.
I feel like I should start crooning any moment. And I take the idea of failure here very seriously, and I think it's an interesting question related to moral motivation, because to fail in this sort of endeavor would be a very serious kind of moral failure, and I think that part of our motivation to act on climate change should be driven by fear of that failure. Now, the idea that ethics plays a role in climate policy is very widespread. Indeed, it's not just it's not just domestic and foreign leaders that often say it, but the language of ethics appears in the UN Framework Convention, in the central motivation, the ultimate objective, and the main parameters that are announced, and also in the principles where we see notions like benefiting present and future generations, equity, responsibility, and the right to sustainable development. However, many people in the policy community in particular are very resistant to the idea that ethics should play a role in climate policy, and insist instead that really the only way forward is to pragmatically harness self-interest, particularly national self-interest. And the ethical concepts, and especially the key notion of justice, are unsuited, indeed hopelessly unfit for the task at hand. And of course, David will represent that point of view. In general, people in this camp often say that ethics is foolish, naive, even dangerous, will lead us off track, prevent us making progress. And then we often see specific anti-ethics kinds of phrases. One which I'm confident about is Eric Posner, who's one of David's co-authors in their previous book on climate change. You can have justice or you can have a climate treaty, not both, right? One which I'm less confident about because it's not entirely clear what was meant by this statement, but still a striking statement by Todd Stern, the US envoy for climate change until recently in Durban: if equity's in, we're out. So in the book, I try to defend ethics and ethics in general and justice as well against this kind of marginalization, explain why I think climate change is fundamentally an ethical issue, why it's not easily eliminated from climate policy. But I don't, for reasons that will emerge, try to offer a comprehensive climate ethics. So some key general claims that I make. First, I think ethics gets the problem right, and I'll say more about that in a minute, that economic realists get the problem wrong, and dangerously so, and that the official rejection of ethics prevents us from raising some central questions that need to be discussed. So let's start with getting the problem right. So I signal three main reasons for taking ethics seriously. First, that we need ethical concepts to identify the relevant problem. Second, that ethical considerations are at the heart of the major policy decisions that need to be made. And third, that climate change itself poses a severe ethical challenge, and really you don't understand what's going on until you understand that challenge. So the first reason that ethical concepts are needed to identify the relevant problem, one of the ways I try to defend that idea is to introduce this idea that there are intelligibility constraints on how we understand the problem and how we understand solutions. So here's an example of how someone might think climate change is a problem. Right? They might think, I have very large holdings in fossil fuels. Right? If people act to prevent climate change, then many of my assets will be stranded. Right? That's the problem. And the solution is to donate heavily in political campaigns and to spread misinformation about climate science. Right? Now, I think that's one way you could frame the problem, but it's not the way that most people understand the problem, right, as a policy problem. And importantly, I think that the reason for that is the way most people understand it inevitably involves ethical concepts. That's a sort of easy, quick example, but a place that's sort of closer to actual policy is thinking about the debate about whether 2 degrees should be the target for global climate policy, where representatives of African nations have argued, some of them very vociferously, that 2-degree target is inadequate, 1.5 would be better, and indeed an objection to 2 degrees is that it would amount to facilitating what they think of as genocide against African nations, right? So very heavy moral objection to the target, and one which is not just an objection about genocide, but there's an underlying idea that somehow 2 degrees would be incompatible with what ought to be the fundamental goals of climate policy, right? If you're not protecting Africa sufficiently, the thought is, then you're not actually framing the problem correctly, right? You're a bit like the stranded assets people. So the second reason I say ethics needs to be there is that ethical considerations at the heart of the major policy decisions that need to be made. So in general, if you're trying to decide a trajectory for climate emissions over time, right, you have to confront some fundamental ethical issues, particularly how do you balance the interests of current generations against the interests of future generations. And even if you're trying to allocate emissions at a particular time, once you've decided on the general trajectory, you have to make decisions about who's allowed to emit and why. And you have to make decisions about whether it matters, whether some people's emissions are subsistence emissions, for example, whether other people's emissions are luxury emissions, right? One way to illustrate this in a sort of bare way is sometimes people say it's not feasible for us to cut emissions dramatically now. And I think that's wrong, actually. It's perfectly technically feasible, right, for us to stop emitting tomorrow. We just all refuse to turn on any devices that would produce carbon dioxide. The problem is not technical. That's perfectly technically possible, right? There are good reasons not to do that, right? Reasons surrounding our assumptions that that would lead to, you know, widespread social chaos, eventually starvation, and so on, right? But to my mind, those reasons are moral reasons. And an important question will become, right, when, okay, so tomorrow, there are good moral reasons not to cut to zero. But maybe the next day and next month, that's still true. But at what point do we have enough time to make a transition where the costs are morally worth bearing, right? And here in the book, in one part, I try to offer an account of what's at stake there that it really amounts to an error theory about people who think that national self-interest, or even just self-interest in general, is the essential driver that we're interested here. I think that if we understand this problem in light of people having a right to self-defense, we get a better moral picture of what's going on, and a much more demanding one than self-interest suggests. So my third reason for thinking that climate change is an ethical problem is that it poses a severe ethical challenge to us. And I have this other book where I call that A Perfect Moral Storm, where the intuitive idea is that, just like Sebastian Junger's book, where you've got a fishing boat caught at sea at the intersection of independently powerful storms, any one of which might be enough to sink it, right? But when they come together, it constitutes an overwhelming, profound challenge. So just like that, in the case of climate change, we are witnessing the intersection of several very big challenges for ethical action, for our ability to respond ethically. These include that the problem is genuinely global, that's intergenerational, that's ecological, and there's a really heavy theoretical component as well. The global framing is the most familiar to people just in conventional discourse and thinking about international relations, and this arises because there's a spatial dispersion of causes and effects, often analyzed along a traditional prisoner's dilemma or tragedy of the commons kind of model. But I'm particularly concerned about the intergenerational storm, where there's a corresponding spread over time of causes and effects. And in particular, there are very long time lags between the emissions, initial emissions, and their full effects being realized in the climate system and having impacts on people over hundreds, thousands of years. And this gives rise to a different kind of collective action problem than the traditional prisoner's dilemma, tragedy of the commons, what I call the tyranny of the contemporary. There's a strong temptation to take perhaps modest benefits now in the knowledge that the potentially severe or catastrophic costs of those benefits come much later to other people when you're no longer around. And I think that's a profound ethical challenge that's even more serious than the traditional tragedy of the commons. But there are also very significant theoretical problem in that this is all happening in an area where a number of things intersect that we find it difficult to deal with theoretically at the moment, and there's a list on there. So what are the implications of being in a perfect moral storm? Well, I say one problem is that there's a risk of moral corruption, by which I mean a threat to the way we think and talk about the problem, especially in the public sphere. Right? There are these strong temptations to, if you like, pass the buck for our behavior, especially to the future. Right? And we are judges in our own case. Right? In the current generation, we have to police ourselves against this threat of a tyranny of the contemporary. There's a risk we'll find ways of thinking and talking about the problem that will disguise the intergenerational buck passing, as I call it. Next implication is that I think there's an institutional gap, that we lack good institutions for operating across generations. I think because of the theoretical storm that we face a worry that we lack really robust theories to just take out of our back pockets and apply to this problem with any real confidence. And therefore, we have to pursue a different kind of moral theorizing, what I call an ethics of the transition, based on thinking about clear cases, avoiding clear violations of ethical constraints, and areas where we can get overlapping consensus. And finally, because of the problem of moral corruption, sometimes we need to practice what I call defensive ethics. Right? If we're at risk of sliding into being judges in our own case and making mistakes about how we think ethically, then we've got to be prepared to defend well-founded moral intuitions in this case. But what about economic realism and getting the problem wrong? Well, one thing I try to identify in the book is that there are actually a lot of strands of anti-ethics argument that we need to consider here, which I see a lot in conference hallways and in public debate. And my general argument is that these pull in different directions, actually. There are definitely tensions between them and sometimes outright contradictions. Right? And an example of a contradiction might be, some people say, well, you can have a pure policy view that is somehow opposed to an ethical view, right? But then they're inclined to endorse later on a view called welfarism, where welfare is a concern for the general welfare, perhaps the national or the global welfare, is the key concern of public policy. And that's clearly an ethical concern, not just a matter of pure policy that's non-ethical, should we say. And then I think there are internal vacillations within these categories as well. For example, I think that people shift around a lot about what they mean by self-interest within a view that's based on national self-interest. Sometimes they mean very short-term economic interests. Sometimes they have in mind something grander, like us, our children, and our grandchildren. Right? And that vacillation disguises a lot of what's going on. So I'm going to skip a slide here. But more general dangers of the economic realist approach, I think, are first neglecting this threat of a tyranny of the contemporary. Right? If you have a view based on self-interest and national self-interest, and it turns out that in fact there's a big tyranny of the contemporary problem, right? The current generation is quite happy to exploit the future, then focusing on a view that emphasizes national self-interest might be focusing on the short term in a way that actually facilitates a tyranny of the contemporary rather than solving it. I think the economic realist view typically leads to a misdiagnosis of the problem as being primarily this tragedy of the commons, where everyone agrees that we should do something, but when acting individually, we undermine that common goal. In A Tyranny of the Contemporary, you lack good non-moral reason to think there is a common goal of protecting everyone. I think there's a worry of a heroic assumption that I see often occurring in policy analysis here, where it's just assumed that national governments do in fact represent the interests of their citizens across generations, across the relevant timescale here being hundreds or thousands of years. I think that's a heroic assumption, which is sort of philosophy code for deeply implausible, perhaps even laughable. You know, it's so bold an assumption. And I think this facilitates shadow solutions, by which I mean solutions that don't get to the heart of the real problem that we face with climate change, which is an ethical problem, but rather say solutions that facilitate what's in the interests of the short-term economic interests, say, of current institutions as they represent themselves. And then I think there are also worries about hidden values. If it's essentially an ethical issue, then the values work has to be done explicitly or implicitly somewhere, and there's a real worry here that it's been done implicitly. And I have in mind here work that I and others have done about economics and fundamental ethical assumptions that are made within economics, often without acknowledgement that they are ethical assumptions. But the biggest issue, perhaps, at least the one you're most interested in today, I suspect, is this issue about the neglect of justice. So here I just want to, and this is a real teaser, highlight a reason for thinking that the neglect of justice and the economic realist paradigm can become a very serious issue. Right? So here's some things that are said by economic realists about climate policy. Like it or not, the only way for other nations to ensure Chinese cooperation is through a special inducement, such as cash or extra emissions rights. Here's the harder question. Should the US be paid for its participation? No one is suggesting such an approach, and this should be puzzling. An optimal climate treaty would probably not require side payments to poor countries. It could well require side payments to rich countries like the United States and rising countries like China, and indeed possibly from very poor countries, which are extremely vulnerable to climate change, such as Bangladesh, right? Now, I think these are not, these are things that are not strongly emphasized in the economic realist view, but they clearly recognize there's an issue here, and I think it's hard to escape given the internal logic of the view. And here's the sort of argument I think that gets us there. First, there's an idea that countries will accept a climate treaty if and only if and to the extent that it benefits them. Second, that some countries benefit more from climate action, in particular emissions reduction, than others. Third, that those that benefit most are the most vulnerable countries. Fourth, that those that benefit least are the richer, high-emitting countries. Fifth, that if the richer, higher emitters engage in climate action only to the extent that it benefits them, they will not do enough to protect the most vulnerable. And so therefore, sixth, to get the level of climate action that's needed to protect the most vulnerable must compensate the richer, higher emitters, right? And most of these claims are just claims that are explicitly made by people in the paradigm. So what do we get from this? Well, we get a polluted pay and polluters get paid kind of principle, right? We get the principle that the most vulnerable net countries, primarily the poor and low-emitting nations, should pay off the large emitters in order to stop them polluting so heavily, where a likely top 10 of the most vulnerable includes nations like Bangladesh, Sudan, Haiti, and so on, and the current emerging large emitters include the US, China, and so on. But I think there are obvious reasons to reject this worry. One is it doesn't actually look very realist, because you might think, well, is there anything the very vulnerable nations really have that the more powerful high emitters want enough to stop over-emitting? Right? They're very poor, so there might not be a lot that countries like ours, rich, powerful nations, actually could get from them that would be beneficial. And if there were, we probably have other ways to get it, right? Because they tend, being poor, to be weak. So rather than paying them paying us off, often it would be probably cheaper or more effective just to go and take what we want. Okay. I also think there's a general presumption in climate ethics against this. There's a broad ethical consensus, right, that such a principle would violate standards of fairness. but just because I'm out of time, I think the most obvious kind of worry, which I explore just a little bit in the book, is that there's a violation of clear ethical constraints here, right? That what this looks like, what polluted pay looks like ethically, is something worryingly akin to an extortion racket, right? And one thing that we don't want to do, I take it morally, is to become the kind of people who engage in extortion, right? I think this matters to us morally, and it would be a deep problem if we thought that we, or the country that acts in our name, was engaged in such a thing. I'm not claiming that we are engaging in such a thing right now. I'm claiming that the worry about the paradigm coming from the economic realists is it seems to endorse an extortionate approach, right? I don't think that David or other economic realists really would endorse an extortionist approach, but I worry that the internal logic of their position drives in that direction, and you need to embrace ethics to get out of that problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. So David, let's go to you to hear your point of view.
Is this on?
Yep.
Yep. Can you see me, or should I stand up? Stand up, okay. I did not prepare slides in the theory that I was talking with a philosopher. They don't usually use slides, and of course the philosopher prepared slides in the theory he was talking to someone who mostly does economics, who uses slides. So there you go, it shows the level of coordination we have. So the question in the book that Stephen and I wrote was, what can ethics tell us about climate change? And Stephen's approach was to ask whether, in theory, ethics might help us, or whether this is sort of an ethical sort of problem. And the approach I took in my sections of the book was to ask, well, what do existing theories of ethics say? And are they any good? Are they logically coherent? Do they provide feasible solutions for the climate change problem? And the answer there is no. And here, actually, Stephen and I agree. So here's a quote from Stephen's section of the book, which is as follows: whatever their other merits, in their current forms, these research programs, meaning current ethical theories such as utilitarianism, Rawlsian liberalism, human rights theory, libertarianism, virtue ethics, and so on, appear to lack the resources needed to deal with the problems like climate change. Moreover, it seems likely that in evolving to meet them, they will substantially and perhaps be radically transformed. So we both agree that the current theories that the very best philosophers have put forward actually fail. Now, at this point, you be the judge. You might say, well, in theory, it's an ethical problem, but right now, ethics has nothing to say about it. Right? Now, does that mean we should follow ethics or not? My view is not. Stephen thinks, well, it's an ethical problem, so maybe someday ethics will help. There's, I think, where we disagree. Okay? So what I'd like to do in advancing that thesis is give you a little background on climate policy, because I think that understanding where we are in terms of climate policy is important for framing the ethical debate. That is, if you don't know what the constraints are on what we can do, then you don't know what room ethics has to operate in. And then I'll turn to several ethical theories that people put forward and talk about what their flaws are. So I'll give you a very quick version of at least my take on climate policy, which is that recent science has demonstrated that we can think about climate change as follows, which is we take all of the past emissions of carbon dioxide and just add them up. So go from, say, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution until today and just add up how much emissions we've had. And we can think of the likely temperature change we're going to get as a linear function of those past emissions. So at about 1 trillion tons of total past emissions of carbon, not carbon dioxide, of carbon, we get about 2 degrees temperature change. At 1.5 trillion, we get 3 degrees. At 2 trillion, we get 4 degrees. Now, there's enormous uncertainty in the amount of temperature change we'll get, but even given that uncertainty, what that does is affect the kind of slope of the line, but not the linearity. Right? So basically, what we get is we can do about 1 trillion tons of carbon before we're at 2 degrees temperature change. How much have we emitted already? We've emitted about 600 billion tons of carbon total since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which means we're 60% of the way towards our 2-degree goal, and we only have 40% left, about 400 billion tons. After that, if you want to keep temperatures at 2 degrees, you have to have zero emissions, right? Not just a little bit, or you're not conserving but still driving to work. You need to have actually zero, right? And zero means nobody emits. So it can't be United States is zero and India is pumping carbon into the atmosphere. Zero means globally zero. Now, when are we on track to hit the trillion-ton target? Well, it depends on what your estimates are about what we're going to do in the future. But at current rates, we hit trillion tons around the middle of this century, perhaps earlier if emissions continue to increase. If we reduce emissions fairly drastically and fairly soon, you can extend out the target date until we have to have zero emissions, till maybe the end of the century or so. But think about a target date as sort of the middle to the latter half of the century if we adopt fairly aggressive climate policies. Right? This puts pretty strict limits on what we can do if we're going to stay below 2 degrees. Right? And we have to work within this framework. If an ethical theory says something else, like India can put in as many coal plants as it wants because it's poor, that ethical theory, I think, has to be wrong, because it's telling us to do something which is going to destroy the planet. Okay, and what that means is pretty much all nations have to reduce using fossil fuels and to start reducing their use of fossil fuels relatively soon. The second implication of this modern science of climate change is we should think about the climate change problem and the ethics of the climate change problem as the ethics of using up unlimited resource. So it's not like a fishery where if you stop fishing, the fish regrow. Right? Here is a strictly limited resource, and any ethics that are going to address the problem are the ethics of the use of a limited resource. Okay, it's also important before we turn to ethics to understand what it means to reduce emissions. Most of our emissions of carbon dioxide are from energy use, which means the burning of fossil fuels to produce the light and air conditioning we have in the room and the power on this microphone. Conservation can help a bit. The United States is particularly inefficient using fossil fuels, but take it even countries in Europe where they're much more efficient. Conservation can help a bit, but at the end of the day, you're thinking about what climate policy is about. It's about energy transition. It's about finding and installing clean sources of energy. Right? And right now we have about $6 trillion of installed energy base, not counting cars and home heaters, short-lived assets in the United States. Climate policy in the United States is about replacing that $6 trillion of durable energy infrastructure with something that is cleaner and also meets the reliability needs that we need. So when we think about climate policy both in the United States and globally, what we're talking about is using a different form of energy. It's likely to be a little bit more expensive, not clear how much more. It's almost surely going to be less reliable and probably going to be more complex. An electric car is far more complex than an internal combustion engine. So if we think about coal and the proposed coal plants to be built around the world, mostly in India and China, what we need to think about is, well, is it a good idea to install those coal plants when they've got 50 to 100-year lives, or think about alternative sources of energy that are cleaner and will be able to not emit carbon dioxide, right? That is one way to think about climate policy is we have enough coal in the ground to power all of humanity at, say, United States standards of living for several hundred years. That coal has to be left in the ground, right? And that's what climate policy is really about. Okay, so with that background, what does ethics have to say? And as I said, my theory of ethics is, well, let's look at what the ethicists have said. What the very best people have said about climate policy using their ethical theories, and are the theories any good? And the answer, I think, is no. And again, I think Stephen agrees with that. So I looked at 3 different classes of theories. They were distributive justice, the theory that the rich or the wealthy should pay more because they're better off than the poor. Backward-looking theories that look at the fact that mostly wealthy nations have emitted more carbon dioxide in the past than poor nations, and what does that have to say about future climate policy? And theories based on equality, the theory being something like the atmosphere is a common resource of humankind, to quote the Framework Convention, and therefore all humans have to share it equally, and then what are the implications of that for climate policy? And my conclusion for each one of these theories is that they suffer from basic and fundamental logical problems. They are sort of internally inconsistent, if you will. They're not well argued. And they don't offer feasible solutions to the problem. So let me go through a few of them. I'm not sure I'll finish all of them, but I'll start with distributive justice. Okay, so there's a lot of theories of distributive justice. These are theories that basically say wealthy people or well-off people have obligations to help people that are not as well-off. They range from utilitarianism or Rawlsian liberalism, the capabilities theories, and similar things. And generally, they have to be applied globally for them to apply to climate ethics. And I'm not going to dispute the issue whether they apply globally, although there's a large literature on this, with Rawls himself, for example, not believing that his theory applies globally. The implication of these theories is something like wealthy nations should reduce emissions more than poor nations. Now, in some sense, that mathematically has to be true. We don't need any theory of ethics for it. If we're going to have zero net emissions, well, wealthy nations emit a whole lot more than poor nations, right? If everyone's going to go to zero at some point by the middle of this century or later in this century, we've got a lot more work to do than a country that's not emitting a lot. So we don't need a lot of distributive justice theories to say wealthy nations need to reduce more just because we're emitting more. So the question is, what does distributive justice have to say? That must mean something like wealthy nations need to do more than sort of just the automatic getting to zero amount that you'd need to do. Maybe reduce emissions faster to create a little more room for poor nations or something like that. It's not exactly clear what the distributive theorists have to say. They never actually lay it out in very clear terms. Okay, so that's the theory. What's the problem with that? Right, sounds pretty good. The core distributive justice claim. So go pick up a book on utilitarianism or global justice or Rawlsian, or pick up Pogge's book that disputes Rawls, or whatever you want, any theory of distributive justice. And look and see what it tells you to do. It tells you you have obligations to help the poor or the less well-off. It doesn't tell you that you're supposed to do it through a climate treaty. Right? What it tells you is you should do it. And maybe the best way to do it is by giving poor people cash, or by giving them mosquito nets, or better legal institutions, or clean water, or by getting rid of our farming subsidies so that they can actually sell their farming products in the global market. There's all kinds of things that we could do that would help poor nations, and that things maybe we should do. At that point, whether we should use climate policy or some other theory is just a matter of the empirics. What's the best way to do it? And philosophy has nothing to say about that. That's a matter of political science, of economics, of other things about how it is best to help poor people. There's whole huge fields of development that try and study this. That is, the theories of distributive justice say nothing about the particularities of a climate treaty. What they say is you have obligations to the poor, not that it should be done through a climate treaty. Now, should it be done through a climate treaty? I don't know. Maybe the best way to help the poor countries is to say you can put in coal plants and we'll put in windmills and forget about that other cash we were going to give you or something like that. Maybe that's the best way to do it. I suspect not. It's very difficult to design good distributive policies. Doing it while you're also simultaneously trying to design a global climate policy is like doing triple backflips. It's already pretty hard to get something like the Paris Agreement. Trying to add into that, well, the best ways to help poor nations probably makes the whole thing come crashing down. But maybe not. Maybe not. The only claim here is that the theories of distributive justice don't tell us the answer to that. Right? That's a matter of pure policy. Right? What's the best way to help poor nations? Right? And I should point out, we agree, this is an underlying theory of ethics. Right? You got a theory saying you have an obligation to help poor people. Right? It's assuming for now that that is a good theory. My only claim is that theory is not good when applied to climate policy to tell us what to do about climate policy. Right? It just doesn't help. What we need there is to think about what's the best way to implement or to meet our obligations on distributive justice. It's also not very feasible. Right? Helping the global poor is an incredibly difficult challenge. For those of you that work on development, you probably know that, how hard it is to figure out the right way to help poor people. Basically, everything we've tried doesn't work. Trying to do that in a climate treaty, probably not feasible. Right? As you know from watching Paris, it was incredibly difficult just to get what we got in Paris. It took enormous effort to do that. Trying to add into that large distributive elements, probably not feasible. How much time do I have? 5 minutes, okay, great. So that's distributive justice. What about responsibility and backward-looking theories? So wealthy nations develop first, And development basically meant, you can think about the Industrial Revolution as ways of transforming energy into something useful. Right? That's basically the Industrial Revolution. Right? Watt's steam engine, burning coal to create steam to generate motion. Right? That's what we did. And so wealthy nations developed first, and therefore we emitted more carbon dioxide over time than poor nations. And the question is what to do about that. Now, there are two distinct theories that philosophers have put forward with respect to past emissions. One of them is those past emissions have harmed somebody. And if you harm somebody against their consent, you owe them compensation. Just like, if you hit a pedestrian while you're driving, you owe them compensation. They didn't consent to being hit, right? And you harmed them, and you owe them compensation. So standard, I'm a lawyer, tort theory, right? You've committed a tort. And the second theory is that what wealthy nations have done by emitting more in the past is use up more than their fair share of limited resources, right? So the atmosphere is a strictly limited resource. There's only, let's say, 1 trillion tons that we can emit into the atmosphere before we have dangerous climate change. And wealthy nations have used up more than their fair share of limited resources. Okay, so let's think about each one of these problems. The harm one is the better theory, I think. There's a number of difficulties with it, which I won't go into here, but are talked about in a lot of the literature, which is, can you have collective responsibility for harm? What about people that emitted in the past that are no longer around? Who's responsible for their emissions and so forth? But the real issue, I think, with the harm theory is that we've had about 1 degree of temperature change right now, and it's really difficult to know what the harm is. I've never seen anyone actually try and figure out, well, what's the harm from wrongful, not all, but from wrongful past emissions? What share does the United States bear, say, versus a poor country? And then how do you do the compensation? But if you look at the estimates of harm we've seen from climate change so far, they're increasing every day. But the estimates are relatively small. Some studies show there's actually been benefits from increased crop fertilization from extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Some studies show relatively modest harm so far. I should say, I think we're facing catastrophic harms in the future, so don't get me wrong. But up to today, 1 degree, you can't really tell. So the harm theory, I think, doesn't inform us very much about climate policy because the size of the claimed compensation due to this tort is really pretty modest. And I did some initial calculations for a paper that's coming out soon, not in the book. My estimates were somewhere around $100 billion total owed from wealthy nations to poor nations. Really back of the envelope, rough cut. But the climate fund that we've already agreed to was about $100 billion. I don't know whether it'll be funded or not, but that was in the Paris Treaty. So the harm theory is not really doing very much in terms of work for a climate treaty. The bigger one is excess use of limited resources. Right? This one is enormous. If you calculate the extra emissions that, say, the United States has emitted compared to the average emissions that everyone in the globe emitted. So you go back each year in the past and say, what were the per capita emissions in the United States? What was the global average? And figure out what the excess is. So that was our excess use of that resource. And multiply that by the carbon price, say the social cost of carbon, which is around $40 right now. How much would we owe under that theory? The answer is enormous amounts. Right? We're talking tens of trillions of dollars of compensation for excess use of the atmosphere. That theory, if it were any good, would have enormous implications for climate policy. The problem with the theory is it's not any good. Right? On what theory do you say that one country has claimed excess use of a given resource and other countries have not been able to do it? Well, you might say everyone owns it equally. But on what basis? Because, for example, we have better farmland than anyone else in the world. I live in Chicago. We have better fresh water than anyone else in the world. We have excess use of fresh water in Chicago and in the United States generally. We owe compensation for that. South Africa has excess diamonds. Saudi Arabia has excess oil. These are all resources that are maybe not diamonds. These are all vital resources that we need to live on, and they're not shared equally. So the philosophical theory underlying this excess use has to be something like limited or valuable resources are shared equally by people. Or you need to be able to distinguish the atmosphere because it's sort of out there and not under someone's land or something like that. But I don't think the philosophical theories can do that. And then you ask, what philosophical theory claims that all limited resources globally should be shared equally by all people, and you pretty much struggle to find one. There's a few out there that people put forward. They've all been rejected. And so the excess use theory is not something that philosophers generally support. Yet when it comes to climate change, they say, well, this is what we should do, not understanding that they're basically logically inconsistent. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up. I'm not going to do the equality theory, but this is the nature of the problem, which is these theories the ethicists have put forward are just not very well argued. They don't make sense. So I agree with Stephen that maybe someday an ethicist will put forward a theory that helps guide climate policy. But until they do, until we have something that makes sense to put forward, I would say ethics is not a very good source for thinking about how to guide climate policy.
So thank you very much, David. I'm sitting next to Stephen, and he's taking lots of notes. I can see he's itching for rebuttal. So what we'd like to do now is move to a panel discussion to add some context to the perspectives that we've heard so far. So I'd like to invite the panelists to come up. We'll have some commentary from our colleagues on these perspectives. And then we'll go to some question and answer and reactions to you. So you want to do it from there, Richard? Okay. So do you want to take some time for a quick rebuttal? Go ahead.
Sure, yeah. So first thing, we don't agree, actually. About this. And as somebody remarks on the book jacket, one of our issues is we don't agree about what we disagree about in a certain way. So I want to try to clarify that a little. So as you've seen from my presentation, I am focused on the ethics of the transition. I do agree with one claim about theoretical inadequacy. I agree with the claim that we don't have robust theories that we're really confident in, that we can pull out of our back pockets and slam down and apply to this problem, right? I actually think that's so that's a thing that we agree on, and David has done a good job of hammering on some issues as to why that might be the case about general theory. But I fundamentally disagree that this justifies eliminating ethics from the discussion, right? And one of the things I emphasize in the book is, though I don't think there are robust theories, and I think we should work towards them, I think there are other ways that we can proceed, right? There are clear cases of violation, like my extortion case. There are cases of overlapping consensus between different kinds of theories, like the main theories of fairness all seem to line up behind the richer, more developed countries should take more responsibility. Those kinds of things seem important to me, right? I don't think we generally assume that if we lack a completely decisive theory in an area, we abandon discussing the topic and we abandon being concerned with the issue. Take, for example, democracy, right? Democracy is an important value. There are many theories out there of democracy. There are many well-known problems within democratic theory, right? One could make a kind of argument of the sort that David's just made about democracy, right? And the details would look interesting and good. But does it mean that we abandon democracy as a value? I don't think so, right? I think we have good reasons to sticking to democracy, like Churchillian reasons that the alternatives are so bad. And in the case of climate, I think the abandoning the whole idea of employing ethical concepts is also bad, for example, because it might lead you to endorse extortion. Do we want to do this sort of one by one?
Sure. Yeah.
I don't want to go on too long.
I guess I'll just repeat it, which is, look, you need at least it's not a question whether the theories are complete and perfect, everything. The question is whether they're even mediocre. And they're really bad. Right? And these are the theories the very best philosophers put forward. So if the theories just are logically, internally incoherent, I don't think they provide very much guidance. Let me say one other thing, the Posner, the paying for quote. When you co-author something, you don't always necessarily agree with every sentence and everything. So that was very much Eric. It would not be something I would have written myself.
What would you have written?
The extortion one, look, I think that when you go to something like Paris, each country goes there looking to both advance their self-interest and do what they think they need to do. And we ruled out in our book lots of things because of feasibility. And I think the extortion claim should have equally been ruled out because of feasibility, which is just not going to happen. The United States goes and says, we want this and this and this in order for us to agree to climate treaty, and people will tell us where we can go. And that's the same sort of argument we make when the philosophers say the United States should pay, I calculated for the limited resource principle, $13 trillion to poor countries. We would tell people where they can go, and we rule those out because of feasibility. And so the same argument that we made about limits on climate ethics would apply to this extortion argument. So it's internally consistent to reject, from our approach, to reject the extortion.
Well, I mean, it's internally consistent in the sense that one can see space within the theoretical framework, but we'd actually need an argument as to why, for extortion in particular, and maybe morally deeply problematic forms of climate policy will, very nicely be dealt with by extortion, by concerns of political feasibility in a deeply unequal world, which most philosophers at least think is structurally unjust in very significant ways, right? So it's a pretty bold claim, I think, to make theoretically that all the feasibility considerations will magically line up with all the ethical concerns in a way which prevents
I didn't say
these
that.
kinds of problems.
The extortion claim was not particularly a claim that I would have made.
Sure. What else do I want to say? Oh, another big thing I want to say on this issue of the focus, the theoretical thing. When I say that theoretical thing about my concern about theory, it applies equally, and in fact, I would say even more strongly, to standard theories in the policy world like cost-benefit analysis, which I'm not quite sure actually in the end how wedded David is to cost-benefit analysis, but many of people in his camp who have been co-authors together are very, very keen on cost-benefit analysis, right? So I would say the theoretical problem applies just as severely in those cases. And indeed, I would go on to argue that ethical concepts play foundational roles in those theories. Right? And I would also argue that for national self-interest. Right? So part of my picture is whatever the strength of the theoretical problem is, and obviously I don't think it's as deep and severe as David does, right? But I would respectfully claim that the same kinds of problems arise for the theories that David needs to rely on, or people in the camp need to rely on. One illustration of this idea is a lot of David's positive view is because of this endorsement of the trillion-ton target. Where does that come from? What justifies it, right? It's actually an interesting and difficult question. Right? Often people say it gives you a certain percentage chance of hitting 2 degrees. There's nothing magical ethically or in any other way about the percentage chance of hitting that target, right, as being the one that we should focus on. Nor is there anything magical about that target itself, right? And its origins are a little murky. And I think there are real ethical issues that come up. I mean, David said that we wouldn't be justified ethically in violating the trillionth ton target. Well, I'm not quite sure what stands behind that. Right? After all, I mean, here's one thought experiment. Suppose we carry on much as we've been doing and don't do very well, and we do exceed, we get close to the trillionth ton limit. Right? If major populations around the world basically have a choice between going over the trillionth ton target and switching everything off in the scenario I described earlier, ethically, would they be unjustified in keeping some things going? I think there would be a major question. It would be a tragic question, perhaps, but it would be a major question as to whether, for example, they're entitled on grounds of self-defense to have at least subsistence emissions. And that already shows you you've got to have an ethical debate about the target and what it means to exceed it. You can't escape it just by legislating a number.
So I'll just ask Stephen a question, which is, you start off saying ethics gets the problem right. And then you say, but the ethical theories are not very good. And I guess the question, how are those two things reconciled?
Right. Yeah, well, one thing that's clearly going on is that for David, ethics means ethical theories, right? Whereas for me, something that's going on is I think ethical concepts have to play central roles, right? And notice that by saying ethical concepts have to play central roles, I'm not yet committing myself to a claim about theories, right? Obviously, it'd be desirable if we had brilliant theories to apply, right? But the fact that we don't doesn't yet show us that ethical concepts should be eliminated from the discussion.
How do you know it gets it right? So here we sort of agree, maybe there's some underlying ethics that might guide us, but how do you know that they would get the answer right if you don't know what those theories are?
Yeah, well, as I say in the book, I think there are other ways to get at getting it right than just a complete ideal theory. I mean, we have complete ideal theories for very few things, in fact. Right? I mean, there are classic sort of examples of good theory. Usually people appeal to physics, but there are fundamental disputes in physics, right? And yet we don't think that we know nothing about physics, right? We don't think we should abandon concepts in physics, right? Because we don't yet have a full unified theory, right? In fact, we think it would be dangerous to abandon
I guess maybe
these
where we
things.
disagree is at what level these ethical theories are. You know, I think they're sort of bargain basement, and you think you're comparing them to physics. And if they're really, really bad, if they're just internally logically inconsistent, don't guide us. I guess the question is, I can't see how they get anything right.
Yeah. Right, well, I think they prohibit extortion. They suggest there's an ethical consensus around the idea that poor countries shouldn't be made to bear the brunt of the transition, or at least poor people shouldn't be able to. And I also fundamentally think, right, that there's a really big issue here, which I really love David to comment on, that exactly the same kinds of issues, if you really want to press on theoretical inadequacy, exactly the same kinds of issues apply to economics and to national self-interest theories. The sorts of
internal logical problems.
Yeah, well, actually, I don't like the phrase internal logical problems because I'm not entirely clear what it means. It's rhetorically wonderful, right? I mean, philosophers would love hearing their internal logical problems, for example. But outside of specific arguments, I'm not so sure. But I do think that whatever the problems are, I wouldn't necessarily describe them as logical problems. Sometimes they're ethical problems. Well, but they equally apply, the ethical problems equally apply to the alternatives that are supposed to replace ethics. That's my view.
I think we leave this portion here for now, and we'll move to the panel for some additional commentary, and then have an opportunity to interact with you. So if I can ask the panelists to come up, and you just switch out seats. Thank you.
I'll see you at the
So thank you very much, and again, welcome everyone. My name is Andrew Light. I'm from George Mason University and the World Resources Institute, where I work on the climate program there. Although our speakers have already been, our panelists have already been introduced, just quickly again, on my far left, but not to my far left, is Gwen Taraska from the Center for American Progress. Then we have Alyssa Bernstein from Ohio University, and my colleague David Wasco from the World Resources Institute. The purpose of the panel is to try to really take this broad, rich discussion and look at some of the current policy dilemmas with a particular focus on international climate policy and which I know many of you in the audience work on here in Washington, and in particular the development and the negotiation of the Paris Agreement, which was concluded last December and which is well on its way to entering into force, we hope, by the end of this year. And so in that respect, I want to start with David and just sort of ask him, having been involved in the climate negotiations in one capacity or another for quite a long time, what he could tell us two things really, sort of what changed since 2009 when the widely perceived sort of failure of the talks in Copenhagen to get beyond the Kyoto Protocol and create a new climate regime, and the success that we got finally in Paris last December. And then secondly, just very briefly, sort of what's the structure of some noteworthy kind of elements, right, of the Paris Agreement.
Great, thank you. Climate policy in 30 seconds or less. So in terms of where we are since Copenhagen, I'm going to cheat a little and go back to Kyoto, actually, which was 1997. And there's sort of been posited that there are two basic approaches one could take to climate policy internationally. One is a top-down approach. Often Kyoto is characterized this way. You come up with a total number of emissions that you want to achieve, a reduction in emissions that you want to achieve, and you push through an agreement that does that. The other approach would be a bottom-up approach where countries come to the table with whatever it is that they themselves are prepared to do, standing alone essentially, and then that becomes what is ultimately the international fabric that's agreed. And that's in many ways how Copenhagen has been characterized, as a bottom-up approach, but one that ultimately, for a variety of reasons, did not work. I won't go into all of the detail. I think that, clearly it's a bit of a simplification to characterize either of those approaches as simply top-down or bottom-up. But I think what we have found with Paris is something that is a bit different. It's been sometimes described as a hybrid between top-down and bottom-up. I like to think of it as a feedback loop, that what's been created is an agreement that really mobilized countries to come forward with what they were prepared to do, but in turn, once countries have done that, also keeps the pressure on, if you will, and continues mobilizing support for taking action. And I think where we came from Copenhagen to here, to come to Andrew's question, is that the world recognized that a fully top-down approach could not work. I think Copenhagen foundered on a conflict over whether it should or should not be a top-down approach or should be a bottom-up approach. I think what we found now is a feedback loop approach that in fact gets us out of that box, out of that top-down, bottom-up box, and creates a new approach to how we can go about international climate policy. I think, I can come back to this later, I think all of that has some important implications for the equity issues that we've been discussing today, but let me sort of quickly give a snapshot of the agreement. The heart of the agreement, in many ways, are the national climate plans that countries brought forward. They're known as the Intended Nationally Determined Contributions, or INDCs. That I is going to disappear soon once the agreement enters into force, essentially. So everyone will go from being intended to actually being married to their nationally determined contribution. 187 countries brought those forward, so essentially universal globally. Just one note in terms of what was included in those, many of them included descriptions of what countries saw as fairness and ambition in the way in which they constructed those INDCs. Then we have the housing for all of those INDCs, the agreement itself, or those NDCs. Key part of that is the transparency and accountability provisions in the agreement, which ensure that there will be continued oversight of what countries are actually doing and a facilitation of action when there are obstacles or complications. There's also an ambition mechanism for the agreement, essentially a process every 5 years to return to the table to continue increasing the level of action. And from my perspective, this is perhaps the most important part of that architecture. And it's within a context, I think it's important to note that the agreement puts in place that there's a goal of keeping temperature rise well below 2 degrees and with an aim of pursuing 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that creates an important context, as well as some language around net zero emissions in the second half of the century. It's also important to note that this agreement is not just about emissions reductions. It also deals with adaptation issues, the question of how to build resilience to the impacts of climate change. And I think very importantly in terms of the conversation we just had, that's very much central to the agreement, as is now the issue of loss and damage, and I'll let Gwen tackle that one. And then finally, a support set of elements in the agreement, particularly around finance. Some of this actually came from Copenhagen and has now sort of been extended and strengthened in certain ways. So that creates the overarching context. Just one note on equity. I think that equity and even justice issues are threaded throughout the agreement in many ways. There are many provisions that address these questions in an explicit way. But there is also, I think, equity embedded in the agreement in implicit ways at various points. And it's important to look at both those explicit dimensions and some of those implicit ones.
Great. I'm going to come back to you on that in a second. But first I want to turn to Alyssa. And I mean, David's described the sort of the essential bottom-up structure of the creation of the Paris Agreement. Do you think that I mean, from your perspective, in the broader frame we got in the debate between Steve and David, between, broadly speaking, ethics versus self-interested approach, do you think this general bottom-up approach around INDCs fulfills a principle of equity that we'd want to see in a climate agreement?
First, I have to clarify. Before I answer, I have to clarify terms. This is what we do. I'm a philosophy professor. One of the people dismissed summarily by David Weisbach. But I do have a response. But just to directly answer the question Andrew posed, equity can be interpreted in a variety of ways. Many of the participants to the climate justice debate prior to Paris were focused on the question, what would be the legally binding commitments to be made in a treaty that theoretically would have gotten agreed to? What would be the fair shares as specified by targets and timetables for emissions cuts? But we didn't get a legally binding agreement of that kind. That is, aspects of that agreement are legally binding, including the requirement to submit the intended nationally determined contributions, INDCs. But those INDCs include targets determined by the countries themselves. And they will not be legally bound to achieve those targets. However, there will be a process of MRV, measuring, review, and verification, or reporting and verification, MRV, which some writers have said will function somewhat like a top-down mechanism. The INDCs are a bottom-up aspect of the Paris Agreement. But the MRV process is not a process of imposing sanctions, certainly not in the form of trade sanctions or anything like that. It will be gathering information, sharing information, and having discussion about, for example, the targets that have been set, whether that is as much as the country can achieve, or can it achieve more, what can it achieve, and what does it regard as fair. So there's going to be discussion of fairness. So that's not a standard enforcement procedure. However, some writers say it will have the influence, it will have an influence, something analogous to enforcement, something similar, because of the value of reputation in international relations and international cooperation. And some have said that'll be a process of naming and shaming. Since this process is now in, it has not been fully specified, and upcoming meetings are going to involve fuller specification of what's going to happen in the MRV process. First of all, it's possible, and I advocate, that it be not merely naming and shaming, but naming and praising, bringing forth examples of especially successful countries with very defensible and ambitious and maybe creative and innovative INDCs. Now, how is all this going to be consistent with equity? Is it or not? So I think it can be consistent with equity. Equity understood how? Well, the countries are going to present their own understandings of equity. We're not going to have a simplistic understanding of equity. Countries are going to specify different types of policy and program that they may be able to put into practice in their, within their own borders. Some of the targets are going to be conditional on receiving further funding, which is going to require cooperation. There's going to have to be discussion of fairness, equity, and justice in the MRV process. That, I predict, will. What do I know? I'm only a philosopher. But I think it could be conducted in such a way as to develop a shared general understanding of fairness, equity, and justice, relatively shared, more or less agreed upon, in any case, much more complex and nuanced, perhaps, than has been the case up till now. And if this process functions correctly, and what is correctly, there's got to be further discussion of that as well. But I think it's conceivable that this entire structure could indeed advance equity, fairness, and justice.
Great, thank you. And we'll come back to that in a second, because I know that David's done some work on equity reference frameworks, which had emerged along the road to Paris as a way to potentially onboard, right, or front load some way of assessing INDCs even before they came out, right, in these in this way. But first, I want to turn to Gwen. And Gwen, one of the claims that came up in the discussion that David brought up earlier is that the question, really, it wasn't a claim, really a question about whether or not something like an international climate treaty is the appropriate place to address the distributive inequalities, right, that are sort of the background to a lot of questions of climate change. And even though now, it's been quite a number of years now, that the bulk of the world's emissions actually do come from developing countries as they're defined in the Framework Convention, right, in the annexes, rather than developed countries, there still is historical inequalities and development needs that need to be taken into account for thinking about an overall distribution, right, of mitigation commitments. Can you sort of say what's the general landscape, not just in the Paris Agreement, but kind of the institutions that were created in the Paris Agreement that might be understood as trying to address some of those considerations about assistance for poorer countries?
Sure. Is this good? So, I mean, I think one of the most prominent examples of a mechanism or an institution, you know, around the UNFCCC that's set up to, you know, focus specifically on the needs of particularly vulnerable developing countries is probably the Green Climate Fund, the GCF, which is newly operational. It's a multilateral climate fund. It's a partnership between developed and developing countries. President Obama sort of famously pledged $3 billion to it for its initial resource capitalization period. And what I think what makes it unique, right, is that it's focused, you know, first of all on vulnerable developing countries, and it's also focused on adaptation and on elevating adaptation finance, because there's just sort of a staggering shortfall in adaptation finance, which is a major problem for countries that are trying to develop. So that's probably the most prominent example of such a mechanism. It's not a proper part of the UN, but it serves the Paris Agreement. And there are many others, right? There's the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. Maybe you guys want to talk about loss and damage later, since it's so tied up with ethical considerations. And as David was mentioning earlier, I think what really strikes you when you read through the Paris Agreement, so beyond just the mechanisms and the bodies, is that there are these values throughout, right? There's an acknowledgement of the special needs of vulnerable developing countries, like the small island developing states and the least developed countries. There's a focus on the need to elevate adaptation finance. And these are values that are woven through, and it's now going to be up to, I think, countries and institutions to, live up to the values that are embedded in the agreement.
Actually, I think let's go ahead and look at loss and damage. I think it's a great example of where, the basic terms of the debate between the role of ethical considerations versus national self-interest might hit the road. This is, can you say to what extent the evolution of loss and damage, sort of as it emerged really most prominently after Copenhagen and actually became a very prominent part of the outcome in Paris, if not in terms of the full force of the agreement, but in terms of, something that had to be agreed upon. It was very controversial, had to be negotiated. It was an absolute stumbling block that could have derailed Paris if we had not come up with an accommodation between some of the poorest countries of the world and some of the richest countries of the world on the creation of the Warsaw International Mechanism, and then, the Paris outcome on loss and damage. So first, explain what this means, and then secondly, to what extent you think that ethical considerations versus self-interest played a role in getting the accommodation that we got in Paris.
Yeah, so I think the loss and damage outcome in Paris is a really nice place to look, right? If you're looking at the agreement and trying to find a place where, the outcome was motivated both by ethical considerations and also by considerations of national circumstances and national self-interest. So just to back up and explain what loss and damage is, because it may not be obvious, that the topic of loss and damage in the context of the UNFCCC is a topic of how we're going to collaboratively address climate-induced harm, right? So economic harm, non-economic harm, harm caused by slow onset events, harm caused by extreme weather events, all of that. Why I, as a philosopher, I shouldn't say that too loudly. Sorry. As a recovering philosopher. Why I really love the topic of loss and damage is that, maybe this is perverse, it's often conflated, right, with other concepts, and so it's prone to misinterpretation. And in the run-up to Paris, this was obvious, right? Loss and damage is often conflated with the concepts of liability and compensation. And so that makes loss and damage in the negotiations, right, a lot more controversial than probably it should be, because the concepts are distinct, right? You can think that we ought to act collaboratively on loss and damage without thinking that, it's helpful to talk about moral and legal concepts like liability and compensation. You can even think that, right, finance is necessary without talking about the concept of compensation. So yeah, just to speak to the evolution of this, loss and damage has always been rattling around the UNFCCC since its inception. But it really came to the fore in Warsaw in 2013. And that's because, right, that's when all of the parties agreed that loss and damage was important enough to warrant a body dedicated to it, right? And so that's when the Warsaw International Mechanism, which we call the WIM, it's such a horrible way to refer to it, that's when that body was created. And what was really interesting about that conference is that, all the parties agreed on the importance of loss and damage and that a body ought to be created to address it. And the scuffle was over where it was going to be situated, right? Whether it was going to be situated within the adaptation framework or whether it's going to have, be conceptualized as having its own sort of pillar. And, it might seem like sort of a bizarre debate to have, right, given that all the parties sort of agreed on the substance. But I think, the concern about a separate pillar may have been rooted in concerns about finance, right? Because developed countries had agreed to targets on finance. They were understood as, speaking to adaptation and mitigation. There may have been a concern that, right, a new pillar could be seen as sort of justifying reopening those closed negotiations on finance. And then there's always the specter of liability and compensation since they're conflated so much. And this exact sort of debate happened again in the run-up to Paris, and there was a debate about whether loss and damage should have its own article, whether it should instead be embedded in the adaptation article. And the result, which was really interesting, is that it got its own article and the prominence that would go along with that. And in the decision text that accompanied the agreement, there's a line that says that we shall not, right, confuse loss and damage with liability and compensation, right? So there's an explicit exclusion of liability and compensation that accompanies the agreement and the decision text. So I think, if you're looking at this outcome, right, it's clear that both ethics and, concerns about national self-interest or national circumstances, right, inform this outcome. On the one hand, right, you have the rise of loss and damage over the last couple of years, playing such an, right, it's become so prominent exactly because everyone on the ground understands climate change to be an ethical issue, right? Everyone understands that climate change is vicious because it harms the people who are least responsible for it, right? And it exacerbates poverty. And so you have the rise of, the importance of loss and damage. You have it in its own article. And on the other hand, right, you have this exclusion clause, right? So, Alyssa, you were talking about national circumstances, so, I think a lot of us in the climate community, both in the government and in the think tank world, we really wanted the Paris Agreement to produce an agreement that the United States could join, right? And if you've looked at the Senate, right, the Senate is not the sort of climate champion that our administration is, right? And so one would want an agreement that avoids certain elements like legally binding emissions targets, like legally binding finance targets. And a reasonable person might also think, right, that talking about loss and damage without that exclusion clause would be akin to sort of painting a bright red target on the agreement, which would, jeopardize U.S. participation. And of course, we want the United States to participate, right? It's in our national self-interest, to use your language. Right, because climate change is a security threat and a health threat and an economic threat, and the list goes on, right? So I should stop.
Okay, sorry. No, it's very helpful, and it frames, I think, not just the other thing that came up in the debate between Steve and David is really the feasibility constraint, right? So, David, I mean, you're in the trenches every day on trying to influence the shape of these outcomes and the evolution of these different mechanisms and stuff. And so loss and damage is one example. There are many others where there's been an attempt where you sort of see the creation of a part of the emerging agreement that tries to address what is perceived as a fundamental question of fairness or justice or equity. In general, how do those things go? How do you sort of balance those kinds of attempts versus the feasibility constraint of actually getting an agreement you can get consensus on? This is a consensus-based process. You've got to get, all the over 190 countries to agree on this. So how do you sort of think about that kind of balance with respect to work that you've done on equity issues in the negotiations?
Yeah, so I think just as there's not that we're not looking at an agreement that's either purely bottom down or top up. So do we have an agreement that's neither purely about national self-interest, nor is it, purely about some well-worked-through theory of equity or justice. But I do think we have an agreement and an emerging regime, I think, even broader than the agreement, that has equity issues and justice issues sort of built into the process. And so I think it's something that will work through, or it can work through, I think. I think there's still it's not a certainty, but can work through over time. But I don't think it will be pure, well worked through theories that we're looking at the end of the day. It's really outcomes, and I think the other speakers have sort of alluded to this, the other panelists here, that this is something that's going to be through the process. Now, how does that sort of manifest itself in the agreement itself? Right now, I think that, or in the Paris outcome, we have elements of the text that are very clearly about equity. They use some of the language from the original UN Framework Convention from 1992, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. There's now a new tagline for that, which, thank God, does not have an acronym yet in light of different, in light of different national circumstances. That is scattered throughout the text of the agreement, through the legal provisions, as is language about vulnerability of countries. Then there are a number of implicit elements that are there. Loss and damage is one of those that I think, without its using language of equity and justice explicitly, recognizes that there are harms that need to be addressed. So too is that the case, I think, with the adaptation and resilience provisions in the agreement. One of the interesting implicit equity elements, I think, is the language around 1.5 degrees, which has gotten increasing attention even since Paris. I think it was one of the sort of a little bit unnoticed dimensions of the agreement in some ways. It wasn't in a lot of headlines at the outset, but I think is increasingly seen as one of the more important steps the agreement took to acknowledge that there are levels of harm that need to be addressed even when one goes above 1.5 degrees. That's certainly the case for small island states, I think, but also countries in Africa have really, and other at least developed countries, have really focused on that as a key outcome. There's also language, interestingly, a sort of explicit language in a lot of ways in the preamble. I don't know how many international lawyers there are here. It doesn't have the binding force of law that the rest of the agreement does, but I think it helps set an important context. And there's language around some of the things that we might expect with equity, but also talks about respecting and promoting human rights, health, local communities, et cetera, et cetera. It actually has quite a long list. And also has the term climate justice in quotes. As far as I know, that's the only international agreement phrasing with a term of any kind in quotes, but here you have noting the importance for some of the concept of climate justice in the preamble to the agreement. But I don't think it's purely incidental that it's there. It was something that Prime Minister Modi of India pressed for very hard, and I think set for him and for India an important context in thinking about how this agreement would work and needs to work over time. Another element, I think, in fact, related to that is the heads of state statements that were made at Paris. And of course, these are seen as, outside the agreement. They're, just a moment in time. But I think it's really an important, those statements are important context setters for the agreement and for the process going forward.
Let me try to address the for some. Listen to the history of that. So climate justice for some.
Importance to some.
Well,
of
that
the
was a
idea of
negotiated, sure.
climate
I mean, this was a negotiated outcome. So I think that, there wasn't a full consensus among the parties about whether to include that language, but some parties felt that it was an extremely important dimension. The heads of state statement, I was going to say, Prime Minister Modi very much focused on this, but I think it's also worth looking at other heads of state statements that were made in Paris. President Obama, perhaps above all, and his statement focused on vulnerability in a very focused way, I think, and addressed the vulnerability both of people in the future, and the planet in the future, but also of particularly vulnerable populations today. And so I think President Obama, without using terminology of equity and justice, nonetheless created a frame that went in that direction.
I don't know, the microphone's off. My understanding of the climate justice for some was the climate justice was put in at relatively the last minute. The United States said we would not sign the agreement unless it put it for some. And so I don't know how you decide whether a treaty or I don't know if it's a treaty agreement is embedding ethics when one set of parties says we need the ethical claim again for some, for justice. Another set of parties say we won't agree to it unless you carve out and say for some.
Well, let's I'm going to open this up to questions, and we can get into that debate. I was actually one of 4 people in the room when that final language was negotiated between the U.S. and India, so I'll be happy to provide the insights that I'm allowed to provide on exactly how that was. But it was fascinating, actually. Is it really quite interesting, because it was absolutely essential for the Indians that this reference go in. It was absolutely essential for the United States that it be caveated in some way. And this is the kind of compromise, right, that's indicative, I think, of this process. Very briefly, pass back to Alyssa, and not to put you on the spot, but just kind of very briefly. And then we're going to open up to questions from the audience and bring Stephen and David back in. From your kind of review of the Paris Agreement, do you think we've taken a step closer to creating the kinds of institutional architecture that Steve has claimed that we have missing, right, to deal with the sort of, to try to create an international agreement that reflects the equity concerns, perhaps of some, not of others?
I actually do think so. Some international problems require, oh yeah. So my answer is yes. Some international problems do require legally enforceable treaties, such as, say, arms control. Others do not. I think the nature of the climate problem, it being so complex, so multidimensional, and so quickly changing, requires a much more flexible architecture. Furthermore, I think this kind of institutional and quasi-institutional structure provides the best, perhaps the best, one of the best ways to reconcile ethical concerns with self-interest, justice, equity, fairness concerns with self-interest, which is the primary priority of John Rawls, who was my professor and dissertation advisor at Harvard. And I'm going to seize the opportunity very briefly to reply to David Weisbach, who made a number of statements that are either outright false or distortions. For one thing, he says, the current ethical theories, including Rawlsian liberalism, lack the resources necessary for dealing with climate change. He says that he and Gardner, Stephen, agree on that. That I'm not challenging. That's true. Stephen Gardner has published an article arguing point by point, he claims, that Rawlsian philosophy doesn't have the resources. I am publishing articles showing that it does have a great deal in the way of resources. One of these articles is a careful analysis of the book published by Posner and Weisbach. I sent it to him. Either he didn't read it or he didn't bother to include my arguments in this
This is too
talk.
personal. This is not appropriate.
But in any case, the structure should be one that enables motivations of self-interest to motivate agents within ethically, morally justifiable constraints. And that, I think, is perhaps achieved by the climate agreement in Paris.
Great. Okay, so can we bring David and Steve, thank you, and back up, and we'll open it up for questions. How are we going to do that, guys? We're going to bring in a couple more chairs? Yeah, why don't we? We have about 20, 25 minutes for questions, so please identify you. We're going to bring a microphone around. Please identify yourself. Please make your questions brief, given the time constraints, and brief answers as well.
Hi.
Okay, we're going to take them in groups of 3.
My name is Chandler Sachs, and I'm an undergrad at Cornell University. And I'm an undergraduate researcher for the Human Dimensions Research Unit in the Natural Resources Department. And this question is for David Waskow. So in discussing these questions of equity, I was curious about the way that these NDCs are reliant on the individual member nations' understandings of economic progress and development, and how these traditional economic indicators are basically assumptions in the multilateral agreements.
Nancy Walker, Elliott School of International Affairs, former Pentagon and huge fan of the Wilson Center. Question for any and all of our excellent speakers. If you had 1 minute with the incoming President of the United States, what would be your top recommendation?
Who's it going to be? We got to know.
Thank you.
Varies a lot.
Okay, one more, please. Yes.
Temperature is one measure of climate change, but perhaps a more important long-term one is going to be sea level rise. I mean, the sensitivity in the past coming out of the last glacial is 20 meters of sea level rise per degree of temperature, global average temperature. And the issue is sort of how fast that might occur, perhaps, and there's some uncertainty going to future generations. But when you calculate, for example, that there's $100 billion of damages, how do you address the issue of ultimately coming to equilibrium and things? I mean, the lawsuit against the Clean Power Act basically says that only affects a dime's worth of sea level rise by 2050, but that's neglecting getting to equilibrium, which would be 400 times that or something. So how do you address and go beyond just thinking about temperature with sea level, which is much harder to sort of adapt to?
Thank you. So David, start with you. Your question directly addressed to you, and then I'm going to ask David and Steve to tell what you would, your one-liner to either President Trump or President Clinton. I'll let you choose if it would be different. And then we'll see who wants to take sea level rise.
So on the question about NDCs, the way in which NDCs are framed is very much as a sort of self-generated set of policies by countries. So that embeds it in their own economic circumstances as a starting point. But as Alyssa mentioned, most countries included some reference to why they thought that their INDC was fair and ambitious in a broader international context. Now, many of those descriptions of fairness and ambition were sort of self-serving in the sense that they, reflected what was already in the INDC. But I think it nonetheless has created a process where, and I think it's part of the broader process that I was describing, where countries have to think about what the implications globally will be. There were many countries that talked about their per capita emissions levels, for example. As we go through an iterative process of countries continuing to increase the level of action that they take and coming forward with new NDCs every 5 years, I think we can see that as an opportunity. It's not the only one, but as a key opportunity to keep doing that. Just one thing I'll add is I think this is important for the broader equity and justice discussion. I think we've gotten to a moment where climate action, really on the emission side I'm talking about now, climate action is not necessarily always a cost, which is the assumption built into some of the theories that we've been discussing today. It's not necessarily the case that climate action is a zero-sum game at the end of the day. And so I think we need to also start thinking about how we can build climate action and think about climate action in a way that actually creates economic benefits. And I would say not just in the sort of the broad GDP sense of it, but really in a more equitable sense even. What are the ways in which specific energy policies, transport policies, et cetera, can enhance the broad economic benefits that policies can bring. And I think if we do that, I think it changes much of the dynamics around that. I think it's an ethical question in the sense that if you're looking, for example, at the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN adopted last year, well, those are ethical outcomes we should be seeking to achieve. Many of them actually require climate action, including in the near term, in order to achieve them. So we need to have a focus on that. So sorry, long answer to.
That's okay. You want to go ahead?
No, I was going to give it the first shot at it to you, the 1 minute.
Oh, thank you very much. So 1 minute, I'll give my advice to President Clinton. I don't know what to say to Mr. Trump at all. I guess one question I have to know is whether she's got a Democratic Senate or not, and whether she's got 60 votes in the Senate, because that really changes what her opportunities are. If she's got 60 votes in the Senate, my one word is carbon tax. Or 2 words, I guess that is. Sorry, not very good at counting. For domestic policy, and if she doesn't have those votes, domestic policy is really going to be centered on the EPA, and you've got complicated questions of coal versus wind and solar that have to be negotiated. Internationally, I'd say coal plants in India. That's the problem that the globe is facing. And you've got to think about how to deal with Modi, and you got 300 million people in India without electricity that probably should have it, and how are you going to deal with that? That, to me, is the central global problem. Let me just say sea level rise. If we were to turn off the lights right now, and no one can go home, you can't drive, the IPCC estimated we get another few tenths of degree of temperature increase, sort of built into the equilibrium. So we're at 1 degree or so now. You know, you're at 1.3, 1.4 or so degrees if we turn off the lights. If we continue to emit, well then, everything's off. Now, I don't know what the equilibrium no one does, I think, equilibrium sea level rise would be if we were to turn off the lights right now. It's looking at past harm. I've never seen an estimate of that at all. But if we continue going, yeah, we're looking at meters of sea level rise. And those are generally built into the damage estimates we see, although not very well because of the deep uncertainty we face with sea level rise, as you point out. So ultimately, it is a matter of estimating those numbers and figuring out how to deal with them.
Yeah, I think if I had a minute, I would let other people, possibly just even David, hammer on what's needed in climate policy. I think for my 1 minute, I would press on that I really do think we face an institutional gap when dealing with profound problems that are intergenerational. And I think we need to fill that institutional gap. And in the meantime, while we're trying to fill it, we need to work on ways of creatively within current structures, sort of artificially holding up that concern and seeing what we can do. But I think that's in itself a big intergenerational issue. And as much as I care about climate change, and I care very deeply and spend a lot of my life writing about it, I think possibly that long-term intergenerational issue of filling that gap is more important, because we'll see other problems than climate change.
Anyone have a short thought on sea level rise other than David's answer? Okay. 3 more questions? Here and then Jesse over here. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. My name is Mahshid Kovari. I teach at Trinity Washington University, and my question is that if Paris Treaty will be affected if England decide to leave EU next week, will be affected or not?
Hi, I'm Fernando Batista. I'm with Invest USC. I was with the World Bank, worked on Montreal Protocol operations, and some of the ethics issues arose in those days. It was a much more pinpointed problem in that sense that it's a very specific one and relatively solved at this point. What I'd like to know is if you could take that problem and sort of analyze how it was solved. Are there other means besides money to solve it? Because the way we seem to have solved all these problems was getting international funds and pinpointing into the specific industries that were affected. And India, China, they had a great argument. You guys polluted this planet. Why should we have to pay for it?
And then Jesse Vogel over here. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jesse Vogel. I've been a consultant at the past 3 COPs with the Center for American Progress and currently work in clean energy finance. So just sort of to go to David Weisbach, you say that climate policy is sort of no place for distributive justice goals, I think. Yeah, sort of.
Not quite. I say you got general goals. Maybe it's good, maybe it's bad. I don't know the answer to that, and neither do the philosophers.
Okay. I mean, I think, like, given the fact, Gwyn says that sort of on the ground, everybody's talking about how climate change implicates ethical questions. Can you talk a little bit more to sort of how you deal with that, the fact that these debates are really unfolding currently, and sort of what the place of theorists, so the responsibility of theorists is to figure out sort of whether or not those ethical goals make sense?
Great. So why don't we start? I'm going to go to Gwen and David who are busily counting up numbers of countries we need to go into force. 55 and 55% over. Brexit, yes? Problem or not?
Not a problem. Short answer. Long answer. So in order for the agreement to go into force, you need countries representing essentially 55% of global emissions to formally join the agreement. Ratification is one mode. There are other modes. The U.S. will probably use a mode called acceptance. There are countries that have committed, including the U.S. and China, to join quite soon, perhaps as early as this year. It is this year in the case of the U.S. and China, that add up to nearly 50%. If India were to do so this year, you'd get very close to the 55% required. So we're looking at a fairly rapid march, and that does not include the European Union. So the likelihood of the agreement moving forward, entering into force, all of the rules sort of knitting together and so forth is not really contingent on what happens with Brexit. I think the interesting dynamic will be, the UK has been a relatively progressive player within EU climate politics. So on the one hand, the UK could become a progressive force on its own were there to be Brexit. On the other hand, it could mean that EU climate policy would be watered down somewhat, that other forces would have greater power. But, I think, nonetheless, any way you cut it, some of the key voices in EU climate politics, Germany, France, et cetera, from a progressive end of things are still going to keep their heels fairly well dug in. So, hard to certainly don't want to predict the vote and hard to predict where things would head, but it won't have an effect on, I don't think, on the agreement itself.
Gwen, do you want to jump in on the money question, or moving beyond money for creating an agreement? Or go Brexit. Go Brexit. Oh, to Jesse? Yeah. Okay, right. That's great. Anyone want to take? I can take a stab at the money.
Other than money?
Yeah.
Well, just quickly, and you might want to add to this, I think the Montreal Protocol on depletion gases that deplete the ozone layer has been a positive example of where money has been helpful. It's been important to enable developing countries to get certain kinds of technologies. But I think really critically important, that agreement did much more in terms of setting a policy environment that led the private sector to move quite rapidly to develop new gases and that were not ozone depleting, or new substances that were not ozone depleting. And so I think you can see in that cooperative model one that actually moved things forward quite quickly without necessarily having money on the table.
Yeah, the way that I would put it, first of all, there's a one kind of answer here, which is on technology development. Critically important. One of the other institutions that was created beginning in Copenhagen and then sort of formalized in Cancun in 2010 is the Clean Technology Center and Network, which has been somewhat successful. So that's sort of the companion piece to the Green Climate Fund. More than that actually has been a variety of institutions created out of the clean energy ministerial process, which is about 21, 22 countries right now, of the biggest emitters in the world, cooperating on clean energy technology. And I think then in terms of, and David mentioned the statements of the leaders at the beginning of the Paris meeting, two of the most important things that were announced there is the creation of mission innovation. So an agreement by, again, 20 countries to double their clean energy R&D budgets by 2020, and then combined with a group of investors, the Breakthrough and something,
Energy Coalition.
the Breakthrough Energy Coalition, led by Bill Gates, who put $1 billion of his own money and then got a bunch of his other wealthy friends to make similar commitments that will work in some fashion with those 20 countries to rapidly accelerate clean energy development. And if you get things, and then the Indians created the International Solar Alliance, somewhat similar effort, different set of parties focused on solar. But the main point of it is that all of these kinds of technology cooperative schemes are really designed to grease the tracks on investment. I mean, no one who looks at climate change and the sort of the costs involved. I mean, David mentioned the U.S. cost investment alone in fossil fuel infrastructure is $6 trillion, right? So if that's right, if we are looking at a real transition, it's not the $100 billion from the Green Climate Fund, it's not U.S. ODA or even combined ODA of all developed countries, which is tiny compared to these needs for a transition. It's about driving investment opportunities. And that's the only way. That is why Prime Minister Modi has the biggest single country clean energy targets in the world, 175 gigawatts by 2022. That was announced before they did their INDC, because he thinks that he can actually create a clean energy economy component of his overall economic structure around that. So David, we'll start with you on responding on distributed justice, and then I think Gwen and maybe Steve have.
Yeah, so really interesting question. And this question I was trying to raise when I was speaking up from the table, which is if you have, let's say, two parties in a negotiation, and one says, I demand fairness, this says, we're not talking about fairness, we're just talking about an agreement, which is maybe a very loose characterization of what happens with the for justice claim in the Paris Agreement. Is that a treaty about fairness, or is that a bunch of guys arm wrestling about what they're going to do? I don't know the answer to that. My intuition is that's a bunch of guys arm wrestling, and some people, they each make various noises when they talk, and you get what you get, right? But maybe you say that's an agreement about fairness. I can see the other side of that. But my take is, look, people are sitting down trying to figure it out, and you get this language in there that is really not binding, and it says, well, we care about fairness and so forth. But at the end of the day, you're getting an agreement based on nations going down and sitting down and figuring what to do. There you go.
And when did you say you had to come on?
Yeah, so I mean, on Jesse's questions about the responsibilities of young theorists, you know, Steve, you were talking about, I think, the disdain that you've heard for ethics, and I've heard those sorts of claims too. I think, though, that it's not so much a disdain for ethics or even ethical theories, but it's more a disdain for theorists who criticize but don't come forward with solutions. And I know that doesn't apply to anyone on this panel. I don't mean to imply that it does. So, yeah, I mean, I was flipping through your book last night, and it was really fun. And no, in a good way. And I saw that you both agreed that climate policy ought to engage more with philosophy. I think you both conceded that. And I think that's probably true, right? Climate policy should engage more with lots of disciplines, right? Engineering, science would be nice, right? All sorts of things. But I think the flip of that statement is also important, right? Philosophy ought to engage more with climate policy. And if all of you young, smart theorists in the room, right, are looking to be relevant, you actually have to go out into the world and get dirty, right, and talk to, educate your Congress people and convince people to follow your perhaps incoherent ethical theories, right, and write op-eds for popular presses with titles like, 5 sexy things that you should know about net metering and that sort of thing, right? It's not pretty and it's not comfortable, but you have these superpowers of reasoning that not everyone have, right? And you take that for granted. And anyway, so for young people soliciting my advice, that's typically, the sort of thing I say.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to say a couple of, I need to get even closer. A couple of general things about the relevance of ethics to climate policy, the distributive concerns specifically. One thing that struck me, and it comes up in the book. So again, we're just giving teasers really for what's in the book. But one reaction I have to a discussion like David's about, well, is it just really arm wrestling and one party cares about justice? Just one of the reactions I have is, well, but notice what's interesting about that situation. The self-interest view is really big on feasibility constraint. As I said before, technical feasibility is not the main constraint here. It's sort of a political feasibility. And it looks like the US in that context is its own feasibility constraint, right? We are our own feasibility constraint about making justice a central part of the discussion. So that's interesting, I think, ethically, and we should reflect on that. The second thing more generally, so there is this argument, and it has major backers within political philosophy, actually, that we shouldn't isolate climate from other things, right? And so what we have to do is sort of global justice, and climate justice will be nested within that, maybe, but it may not take a particular form in a climate treaty. So there are people who agree with David amongst philosophers about that. But I'm hesitant about that general idea, and it's partly because I have theoretical concerns, but mainly because I have practical concerns. I mean, on the practical side, it doesn't strike me that the imposition of a theory of global justice is very likely in the near future. I mean, in the other book, I suspect David doesn't endorse this because it's in the other book, but not in this one. But in the other book, Posner and Weisbach say that we should have a global welfare treaty, right, and do all the distributive work there. And I have worries about that idea, but I don't think we're remotely close to that. And I'm very worried that what we do in climate policy might make things worse from the point of view of distributive justice and compound injustices that occur elsewhere. So I think at the very least, we should try and design climate policy that doesn't worsen the overall justice situation on the planet. So that's a reason not to just ignore climate justice, because there's this, we could do everything with a wider theory if we had one and we were prepared to implement it. So one just last thing, on the slightly more theoretical side, it's just not obvious to me also that we generally think because we could do things at a comprehensive level that we should. And one sort of silly example I give in the paper is that, if I'm charged with cutting up my kid's birthday cake for the guests, right, I tend to just cut it up into equal parts. I don't think to myself, who has the highest nutritional needs, right, in here? I don't try to get an overall picture of, let alone who has the highest welfare perhaps over their entire lifetime, right? So, I give all the little kids little tiny chunks and most of the cake to grandpa, right, because he's lived longer and he's not likely to be quite as prosperous over his lifetime as the others. I just don't do that. And so I have a theoretical kind of background concern about the real drive towards let's subsume everything under a big general theory and not worry about climate. It's just not what we do in other areas.
We're going to lose the room if you've got something very, 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 very brief.
Following up on what Stephen said about what we do, what philosophers do, among other things, is pay careful attention to how to define terms, clarify concepts. And the term self-interest has gotten used a great deal. It's a discussion of self-interest is a large chunk of the book co-authored by these two men. It's used with very diverse meanings. And one other thing that good philosophy training teaches is actually read the texts that you talk about. John Rawls wrote The Law of Peoples, which is the moral basis of international law. It's not cited at all by Posner and Weisbach in their book or by Weisbach in this co-authored book.
Okay. All right. Okay, well, thank you all very much for coming. I really want to thank David and Steve for traveling a long way, and I know difficult hurdles, overcome many hurdles to get here. The book that David and Steve have co-authored, there's a sample copy outside. There are flyers there. You can get the book at a very significant discount. Want to thank Alyssa, Gwen, and David Wasco for here, and especially our partners at the Wilson Center, Roger Mark DeSouza, Benjamin, our team from the Institute for Philosophy and Public Policy, Jesse Kirkpatrick and David Morrow for putting this together. And we'll see you at the next one. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'll just add that this has been webcast live. There's a video archive of the event, and you can see it on a New Security Beat blog, newsecuritybeat.org. We'll have a summary of the discussion. So thank you.
No, but this issue, unfortunately,